Welcome to this course on the ancient classic philosophers. What you're looking at right now is a famous painting by Raphael. Now, it's called The School of Athens, and it was his way of paying tribute to this very important group of classic philosophers, the early Greek philosophers. And the way he paints each of these philosophers, the poses that they're in, and where he puts them in the painting shows his understanding of both their importance to the school as well as their particular worldviews and approaches to how they saw things. For example, if you look right in the middle, you see Aristotle and Plato standing right in the middle, and one of them is pointing down, that's Aristotle, and one of them is pointing up, and that's Plato. And that shows you a little bit about the way that they saw the world and understood the world. Off to the left, you see Socrates is actually arguing with a group of people. If you look around, you'll see Pythagoras playing with some numbers. The fact is, as you learn about the philosophers, you can actually identify each of the people in this painting, and it is such a fantastic tribute that Raphael gives. The question, though, is should we be paying tribute to them? Should we be even learning about them? Is there any value in the study of these ancient thinkers? I mean, isn't philosophy just kind of a waste of time? But the truth is that science and politics and logic are all things that our culture finds very important, and they're things that we get from these ancient philosophers. We owe a lot to them in these areas. They changed the way we think about a lot of things. They gave us tools and categories to help us build upon and reach new ideas. And in this course, we have three main goals. I want to provide you with three things. A broad global overview of the important classic philosophers. But I want to provide that so we can see how the science we take for granted today arose from their rigorous thinking and even from the tension in their arguments with each other. If we think of science or even new ideas as being a progress which just builds upon the previous things we've learned, we miss a really important part of the progress of science, which is that it happens through tension and through crisis and conflict. And yet that's something the early philosophers understood and even taught us. Number two, I want to provide a better understanding of how our contemporary views came to be so you can make informed choices about your own views, rather than simply accepting them merely because they are contemporary. They're not wrong because they're contemporary. They may or may not be right because they're contemporary, but if you understand how we arrived at them as a culture, then you can make informed choices about which ones you want to adopt and whether it makes sense to do so. And finally, not just to learn about philosophy or even what to think, but to learn how to think. This will help you in any course you take in any field going forward. And along those lines, you should understand two things about philosophers. One is that they love questions, and the second is they love to define terms to help find answers. So the first really important question is, what is philosophy? It's a good place to start. Philosophy actually comes from two Greek words, or it's actually one word put together, but the words literally are philo, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. It's this real love of learning, of this wisdom. But as a good philosopher, your next question should be, well, then what is wisdom? And that's something we could argue about a lot. But for the context of our course here, let's keep it pretty simple, and let's say that wisdom is a pursuit. It's a pursuit of truth and of knowledge, of an accurate perspective of the world. How do we see the world? Do we see it the way it is? And that's what we're pursuing. We're pursuing seeing things the way they are. It's this relentless pursuit of wisdom, of knowledge, of truth, of accuracy. That's what we see in philosophy. Paring things down to try to get to what really is it all about, right? And along those lines, we find out that each philosopher tends to focus on just one or two questions. You can't possibly pursue everything. And whatever a philosopher focuses on at his time, in his place, we call that the philosopher's project. You can't pursue everything at once, so the philosophers spent their life really on one or two fundamental questions, the ones they felt most important, that other people could build on, or maybe that would answer the basic questions about everything. Right? And so here's some examples of the kinds of things that philosophers studied. But the real question is, why at this time, about 700, 600 BC, why is it that at this time philosophy suddenly was what we call birthed? Surely people had been asking these questions before that. They had been trying to explore certain things before that. What made the birth of philosophy now? And it's really interesting because, in fact, the world was at a unique place. And there were several things that were occurring that made philosophy possible as it came about that hadn't really been before. Three really key things. Number one, the world shrank. We've seen the world shrink in our own time, but it happened here too as the Greeks conquered vast portion of the world, an amazing portion of the world. And as Greeks not only conquered it, but their culture began to permeate. We begin to see people gather, and they gathered in what were called city-states, and they gathered from all over, and this allowed worldviews to be compared and contrasted. In other words, somebody could begin to see that the gods I believe in, the Zeus I believe in, or the ideas I believe in, the politics I believe in, not everybody in the world thinks the way I think. And they began to really see that. And then the question began, how do I know who's right? How do I know which truth is more accurate than any other truth? That's a really good and reasonable question. And so the question of how you determine truth became really important. And this was very important for philosophy. There's another thing that was happening that compounded this. And that's that up until now, people shared their stories, they shared their ideas, and it was all done orally. Not entirely, but mostly. But in the time of this 700 to 500 BC, we began to see a lot more things starting to be written down. And as there was written language, spoken myths became written stories, and therefore they became testable. You could look and see, is there consistency? Where is there inconsistency? Where did the things not line up with reality? When I share a story with you, there's a certain amount of leeway I get, a certain amount of leniency that you give me, and a certain amount of just lack of memory if you don't hear everything I share. But once these stories became written down, then suddenly you begin to realize that yes, indeed, that we can now test this, whether this is actually true or not. And finally, the third thing is that survival didn't take as much energy and as much time. Because of the general peace and a new prosperity for a lot of people in the Greek world, and frankly, because of slave labor for some people, there was now time to think about bigger pictures that went beyond mere survival. And so this itself became kind of a significant issue. So these three things really allowed the birth of philosophy for people to kind of move forward. It's a testament to Socrates and how important he is to philosophy that we call the philosophers which came before him pre-Socratic. Obviously, no one knew they were pre-Socratic until after Socrates came around, but it shows you what a pivotal figure he is. Aristotle calls these early philosophers the first scientists. He says that they really were determined to find answers to basic questions without resorting to just what they'd heard, without resorting to just stories and traditions and myth. Now, it's not to say that none of them believed in traditional answers, but that everything was fair game to be examined, and they were really determined to find ways to see what was true, to determine what was true, and this was part of their quest. And they had two main projects, these pre-Socratics. The first project, the first question was, what is the basic substance of life? Think about that. That's a really reasonable question. Where does life come from? What is it that makes life? They noticed, for example, one of them noticed that water was always there when life was there. So he began to surmise from this observation that maybe water was the basic substance of life and everything was made of water. That's not entirely wrong, but that's a really good question. Second question that they argued about was, how does one thing change to another? Again, a really good question. Because if it's true that the basic substance of life is something that's the same for everything, then how does this one thing produce many different things? Do things actually change? Do they build out of that, or do they just appear to? Or is there not just one basic substance? Maybe there are many. So if things change, then you can have a basic substance which becomes other things. If they don't change, then maybe you have to have lots of substances, but then where do those come from? It becomes a very important question, and as you can see, very similar to a lot of what we wrestle with in science today. And this is what we owe to these first pre-Socratic philosophers. So when we come back in the next course, we're going to actually meet some of these pre-Socratics, and we're going to learn the specifics about how they answered those two questions. We're going to learn about the Milesians, who are from Miletus. We're going to learn about the Eleatics from Elea. We're going to learn about the Athenians, and we're going to learn about Democritus. And we're going to find out how they answered those questions. So while you're waiting, before you take that course, maybe you should think about it a little bit. How do you understand those questions? What is the basic substance of life? And how do things change from one to another? How is it that change is a reality? What causes that? What is the force that makes things change? We've answered some of these things in science, or have we? Maybe you should think about it a little bit, and we'll talk about it next time.